Welcome back to the very best and your absolute favorite fishing podcast, the Surfcast Podcast. Now, see, I just made your opinion for you, so I need you to know that, everyone listening right now, that this is your favorite. Right,
if you
Toby?
don't think so, you're wrong.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Today, we are going to be combining two topics that we really have not hit on very much. One of them being very near and dear to my heart, and the other one is a huge pain in the ass. And that is using glide baits around fussy fish. This is something that you and I both utilize. I feel like I don't want to speak too much for you, but for me, the glide bait is a lure that I will use all the time in all kinds of different situations. It's more about the presentation and where I want the plug to be in the water column and what I want the action to be versus what the fish are doing. But I will say that I will use glide baits when fish are fully blitzing, and I've talked a lot about that in the seminars. I'll use them in more typical conditions where the fish are somewhere in between, but I will say they're a plug I reach for a lot when the fish are being fussy, and that's sort of the impetus for this entire talk. So before we get into the actual glide baits so much, Toby, do you mind if I just lay out my couple of basic theory about why I think fish are being fussy most of the time? Okay.
Yeah. Because I think it's going to help because when we kind of talked a little bit about it, once you got into it more, it helped me to direct my thoughts and actually kind of figured out, wait, I was doing that subconsciously,
okay.
which I'll explain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So my theory, and this has really been played out through my experience, and I think I've sort of proven as much as I can prove it. Fish are fussy usually because of two different things. The first is that they're on a bait. They're not being fussy at all. They're on some kind of bait that you're not replicating. Now, this has been proven many times by, there's no fish in front of you, you're not catching anything, and all of a sudden you switch to some lure that you don't usually use, and boom, you're into fish, and you're catching fish, gangbusters. Or you change something about your retrieve speed, or something like that, and all of a sudden it goes from 0 to hero. To me, a lot of times that suggests that the fish are there, they're feeding aggressively, but you're not doing something correct. So the fish aren't necessarily being fussy, but you have to do something very specific to catch them. You see what I'm saying? So, a great example of this for me sometimes is squid. If fish are on squid, they won't take anything but, a soft plastic worked a certain way. But as soon as you do that, it's lights out. That's a good example of they're being fussy because you have to do something very specific, but they're not really being fussy. They're feeding pretty aggressively. The other side, and the thing that I think I run into a lot more, and I bet anglers up and down the coast do, though I could be wrong, is that fish are being fussy because they're not really turned on. And in my seminars, I say these are cruisers. So these are fish that are being opportunistic. They're looking for food, but they're looking for really easy foods, and you really have to turn them on. So they're really turned off. They're not, hanging out in the middle of the day, digesting, as I've heard many other anglers say, especially boat guys, and they're just kind of chilling. They're not that. They are looking to feed, but they're not in an active, aggressive mode. I actually think that many times, maybe even most nights in my spots, this is what I'm dealing with. Sometimes they're a lot easier to turn on, and they're sort of a little bit more aggressive, but other times they're a lot less. And so I believe in those situations, triggering something instinctual in the striped bass versus focusing on some certain specific profile and bait is what you really want to do. And before I kick it over to you and see if you believe any of this or I'm just talking BS, I believe that the glide bait is one of the best tools to kick them into gear. But I'll talk about that next. I want to give you a chance to jump in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, when you were explaining it to me, we were talking it out a little bit here before. I think I'm very similar in carrying the glide bait a lot as you, but it does not come out of my bag all the time. I go for a lot of nice romantic walks with glide baits in my bag, and they don't go and get any fun and play.
Okay.
They stay in there a lot. I kind of use, like, for for a while years ago when I first discovered them for myself, I used them a ton. And then other things filtered in and out, but they stayed in for these certain situations. And I started to kind of piece together that I think, like I said before, subconsciously figured out that when the fish are not doing what they're supposed to be doing at a given location, they're not where I think they should be. It's not, I'm not going to call it an easy bite, but it's not a predictable bite by the standard rotation that I would run through. Out comes the glide bait. And not always, it's not magic. But if those other standards didn't work, more often than not, if something does work, it ends up being that glide bait. So I think it's kind of that scenario, like you're saying, that maybe I'm not replicating what they're feeding on, because I kind of for the most part, I'm only replicating two basic presentations with whatever I'm throwing. So if they're not on that, then I got to figure out a way to get them to try mine. Or again, they're just kind of moving and like not in that hard active feeding. So you got to almost like more so trick them into feeding and triggering that bite and getting them to do it. And I think in especially one real specific scenario, I think that's what happens with the glide. That other baits, the darter's the closest to doing it, but the glide for quite some time has just far and above been the best to step in and produce there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. The glide bait is interesting because I think it tackles both of what I'm talking about at the same time. I think that sometimes the glide bait works because it is a different profile than anything else I'm carrying in my bag. I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say probably this is really true for most of you listening to this, because most things or everything else, I would say, in your bag is long and tubular. So even if it's a metal lip, it's still long and tubular. And there's a certain vibrational pattern. Forget about what it looks like, but there's a certain vibrational pattern and pressure wave that's going to come off something that's long and tubular, especially if it's a darter, needlefish, soft plastic. That's kind of gets tricky because they're soft, so they're putting out something different. But these tubular things are putting out a certain vibration, whereas the glide bait is a taller body. Some of them are thick. Most of them are pretty thick. And that is putting out a different vibrational pattern, different pressure wave. And so now, is it really that you're turning the fish on? Or is it then you just gave them something completely different to look at that maybe is closer to what they're feeding on? But on the flip side of that, and again, I want to give you a second to jump in because I don't want to get too far ahead, but the flip side of that is, for me, the movement of a glide bait, especially a swimming one, which I'll talk about, versus a jerk bait style one, is so aggressive and so it triggers them to feed so aggressively that you turn them on. So I don't know sometimes which one I'm doing. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I first started fishing the glide bait and I was like daytime testing it out, trying to figure out how it works on its own, what things I would imply on it would make it do, I quickly saw, like I immediately saw a comparison to if you've ever seen a lone bunker. Yes. That is either separated from or breaks off from its school, and it gets into what I can only describe as an oh shit mentality.
Yes.
And it's just like, I got to get somewhere. Ooh, here, not here. This
Panic.
is not it.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's just like, that's what I saw come out of it. And I think of it immediately with the bunker, but I've seen that with other stuff too, with porgies, with even blackfish at night when they're napping and you wake them up and they're like, Pah! And they blast away. Like, a lot of stuff does that. And I think that aspect potentially of what the glide bait replicates might be that trigger point, that turn on thing that if I've seen it, the limited amount of time I've looked at the water versus the striped bass that live there and see it far more often. I think that then you're replicating something that they're perceiving as food getting away, I have to eat it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I think there are certain lures that stoke the striper brain in such a profound way that if they're not turned on or they are being a little bit fussy or something, you cut through all of that. Look, I think there's all kinds of theories about eels and blah, 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 blah. But I think an eel is the ultimate example of cutting through all of that. You can, even if they're so turned off, they're barely even interested in eating, it cuts through all of that and they have to eat it. A great example of a plug that I think does this, and it's out there now so much, is the dock. The dock spook is another great example of this, where it cuts through that. There's something about that back and forth motion, which, by the way, spoiler alert, looks like a glide bait. But it's something about also the buoyancy of it, how it rests in the water. I think how it hops, the combination of those two things, it cuts through. To be frank, and Toby, I don't know if you're going to agree with me on this. I think the reason that the SP Minnow, one of the reasons the SP Minnow works so well and does what it does well, is because they got the noise right. They got the vibration inside right, and that cuts through. And again, we have our feels about SP Minnow and its overuse and its productivity with really big fish. And you're smiling right now and almost literally biting your tongue. But I think that that's another example, potentially, that does that. The glide bait, the motion, the erratic motion of a glide bait, I think it cuts through and it really triggers something so instinctual. The striped bass cannot resist. It only reacts because you're like taking that little neuron in its brain and you're turning on those sodium channels. Bingo, by the glide bait, because it just works to turn it on. The darter is another example too, where on most nights that very natural motion, blah blah, all of the, you can start extrapolating out. But I think that when we pick apart these very specific lures that really, really cut through, that get close to an eel, when it comes to fussy fish, I think the glide bait fits in there really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. I agree. There's definitely something there. Like, I never made the SP Minnow comparison. And I won't embarrass the darter and the glide bait by putting them in the same category, but I guess I can see where you're going with that.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, it isn't so simple, though, as how many anglers use an SP Minnow. It's not so simple when the fish are being fussy as to throw the glide bait out there and to just reel it back. Honestly, many times with the dock, it is that simple. You throw it out there and you work it correctly, which sometimes can actually be a little trickier to use, I think, than some anglers think. Especially if you get used to it, you think, oh, it's easy. But if someone's learning, it can be a little tricky to get that pattern just right.
Yep.
But I think with the glide bait, you have to be thinking about where the fish are on the column and how they're reacting. And sometimes that means a lot of slow work with the glide bait and then speeding up and being erratic. And other times it's start to finish fast and erratic. And those are sort of my two things I do when the fish are fussy. And my biggest tip for anglers who are trying to break down fussy fish with a glide bait is to actually use a swimming style. So I don't know if I've gone into this on the podcast, so I'll do it really quickly. There's sort of, in my mind, probably three different kinds of glide baits. There's like stick baits, which are very bucktaily, needlefish-like, which may be a little bit less active. There's the jerk bait style, which on a straight retrieve don't do very much, but when you start giving them tip action, they dart back and forth in a very walk the dog, spook type manner. And then there's the swimming style gliders, which when you reel them through the water, they swim back and forth and rock side to side sort of. So they swim back and forth in a very, very natural manner. When I'm trying to trigger, and I'm thinking of these very specific places and spots and conditions in my mind, as I'm sure you are, Toby, as well. And maybe you have an example, and I'll kick it to you in a second. But in those situations where I'm trying to do this, I usually start with a swimming style these days. And that wasn't always the case. And for those in my seminar series, they might be a little bit surprised listening to this because I used to hammer the jerkbait style so much. But these days I've shifted a little bit. I've been optimizing and, changing my rotation and stuff. And I really like going slow, moderate with the swimming style and then just putting the foot on the floor and just going full gas, full fast, wham, 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 and trying to get that thing go da-da-da-da-da-da-da, back and forth. And then you can only do that so much before it starts to break down. Even the best swimming ones, you'll roll them. So you want to push it right until the fact that they'll start to roll, and then you stop. And there's something about that. Ba 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 ba. The fish just can't resist it. And I really think I break through to those fussy fish. So what do you think about that foot on the pedal?
I kind of, like when I was, again, going back to when I was first using the glide bait, I started off with like a similar darter retrieve on it. Straight motion, every so often a pop, would get it to skim out, and they were kind of more of the swimming style. I never really sped them up. I've still, based on some of the times you've talked about that, even specific glide baits that you use that with, and a couple stories you've told me about, like when you had that moment of maybe the speed increase can help with it. I've played with it. I still haven't gotten successful positive feedback on the speed aspect of it yet. It's partially I haven't put a ton of time into it because I kind of go like I start my glide bait retrieve on darter retrieve, and then I will amplify the popping, the jerking, the extra piece into it. But it's kind of like if that doesn't work, then I drop back. I don't go, I'll take one step forward. I don't take to the third or the fourth step in the progression.
Sure.
Maybe every so often I will, but I'm not giving it a fair shake yet to say it is or isn't working. But it's like it feels so unnatural to me still to this day to go too fast with anything, and I just can't bring myself to do it for a whole retrieve or a couple of retrieves. Even like totally everything with the rig deal. There's a piece of the rig deal retrieve that's what I would do. And even then I couldn't do it for long. If I didn't get a hit within a couple of seconds, I would then revert right back to like normal. And it's still sort of the same with the glides, but it's what I've started doing on, we'll call them those fussier fish nights. And I've got this one spot that has sort of, once I started fishing the glide, always produced when nothing else was. But it's a small window of the water. There's you can't see anything noticeably on the surface. There's nothing that says there's something different in this little piece. But that's where the fish are when they're in that mode. They're either kind of everywhere, they're nowhere, and nothing works on it. So everywhere meaning anything I throw, I'm going to catch on.
Okay.
No, they're nowhere, meaning I've gone through everything and nothing. But we were on that like fussy scenario, we'll call it for this. And the glide bait is what's working. I cast it to the stretch, and when I get through this sort of imaginary lane that I've produced, when I get to there, then I will kick it up a hair. I might easy, slow, and I'm just sort of swimming that thing nice and easy, and it gets to where I perceive the bait to be entering that window, and then I'll give it some kicks and pops, and like I'll do that little tiny gap of going up to level 3, and they'll hit it, or they won't, and then I'll come out of it, and then I'll revert back to like slow, and if nothing happens in a few, then I just motor it in and I'm done. So maybe I am kind of like going there, but not a full retrieve commitment to it yet.
Yeah, and I'll admit, it's only been a few years, really, honestly, more like a couple of years, where I've really gone confident in this and really use it reliably. And I will say, though, well, no, I was going to say it's just a couple of spots, but actually on sand beaches, I do this a lot now, too. And it's like it touches down, I let it settle, and I get into it right away. I right away get into going fast, stopping, going fast, stopping, going normal, going fast, stopping, going fast, stopping, going normal. Like I do a lot more fast the entire way in. But I will also say that this is not the default. Again, this is going to be a roll down presentation, so I'm going to go through my bag probably before I try this. So I'm going to try all the different plugs and presentations that I have first before I slide into the fast retrieve with the glider. That said, there's a spot now where for a good chunk of the season, it's been so productive. It is number 3, 4 on the list of things to try, not number 12 or 15 on the list of things to try. So it really has made a big difference. And also, and you got to this very well, I will do this even if the fish are being aggressive and not fussy at all, particularly if they're in a specific place within the spot, because I believe that going fast or panicking, it's sort of a very natural reaction as, if the bass is sitting there and they're feeding, but they're like holding in a zone, they see that bait coming towards them and it doesn't react. That's very unnatural and could turn them off. So you want to go, you want to. So I have like this imaginary scenarios. They're not imaginary, it's real, but like I'm envisioning it in my mind in the dark of where they are. And as it gets closer, I'm going fast. And again, I'm not casting directly where they are, because then by the time I connect and stuff, it's gone, or, it needs to come into them or whatever. Yeah. So I think that's true. Now, Toby, if they're being fussy and you're going to use a glide bait, if you're not going to go fast, is there anything else that you would do? Just curious.
You mean any other retrieves with the glide?
Yeah.
I've tried some other stuff, almost like the slowest possible retrieve to kind of replicate, almost hanging it and just coming across, and haven't done anything. It's, I when they're fussy and I switch to the glide bait, it's like if in 2 casts they're not on it with the glide, I'm off and onto something else. Whether it's moving throughout if I plan to fish a 150-yard stretch, if they're not above it and I work down and not much going on, like hitting this place in it that I think they often are when they're fussy, and if they don't right away, then I move down and I'm cycling through. I don't then spend a lot of time there and like try to really work it and say, well, they're gonna be, even though they're fussy, they're still gonna be there. Like I kind of move through and I come back, but if I get any sort of a response, then I stick on it. Then I stay with them, and I'll even, like I've talked about it in other subjects, even if they're fussy and I find them on the glides, I don't stick with it. Like if I catch, let's say I get 2 fish, well then I immediately switch darter and I'll take a darter cast or 2. And if nothing happens, then I go to a needle or a metal lip or something different, or a soft plastic. Like I still, even in this case where I've already proven to myself to a degree that they're not hitting everything, but now I figured them out, I check if there's other stuff sort of to further solidify in my mind it is that plug, or is it just a pod that I, total chance once again found with the glide. And a lot of the times it really it does tell me that there's something about that glide bait working through there, that there is something that triggers, and whether it's the way, like you said before, what the glide bait replicates and how it's able to turn them on when they're not on, or if they're not on something but it still gets them to go. It does something. There's something there.
Definitely. And I agree with you. This is something I don't think is unique to us at all, but it's definitely less common, and that's that if we're catching a couple of fish, even if they're big, we often are taking the lure off and putting something else on to see if we can do even better. Because there's something about where we caught the fish, how the fish reacted, blah, 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 that tells us that maybe we could do even better and put something else on. And that's an interesting thing maybe for another topic another time, but I wanted to grab onto that because you kind of said it in passing. But yeah, I think that the glide bait is underutilized, but I think it's not just that they haven't seen a lot of glide baits. It really is something very specific about the way it moves. They just can't, to put it very basic, they can't resist it. They don't have the mechanism to say no. They just overwhelms them, right? Mm-hmm. So with that said, I don't want to leave people with no glide baits to try. So if you had to pick a couple to use on fussy bite, what would you pick, Toby? I mean, not just what's the best glide bait, but in this specific case, what would be some options they could get?
This year, what has really come into my rotation is that the Tsunami Tidal Pro
Twitch bait.
Twitch bait, thank you. Yes, that larger one that they just came out with, like 5 inches.
5 inches.
And what's kind of funny on that one is, so the one that I have, so here's a little sidebar on it.
Okay.
It's Parrot. It's a bright color.
Okay. Yeah, I have one of those.
Only ever done well on glide baits on bright colors.
Oh, interesting.
I have spray painted them black. I've done brown. I've had other colors. It's white, gold and white, yellow, or Parrot are like the only colors I can produce on. No idea why for me that dark ones, because again, back in like the early days of me playing around with them, I was like, well, if the light color's working and dark night, dark plug, the dark one's gonna work. I couldn't buy a hit. I actually have one. It was one of the stick shads.
Oh.
That I got in some random color that I just needed one, and I spray painted that one black and fished it a bunch, couldn't get a touch, and then it's got a coat of white on top of it, and then a coat of yellow. Like, this thing had just multiple layers of paint on top of paint, and
extra
now paint
thick
chipping through. Yeah, So that was a quick little sidebar that I thought of when I was thinking of that tsunami that I hadn't really mentioned was the color side. But the tsunami I get a lot. The fatty lures, glide bait. That was the one that I first really fell in love with and did extremely well on it in the early days of me playing with glide baits.
Well-made stuff. He makes good stuff.
Yeah, that one. Those are, Jay makes one. He made a couple glide baits for he and I to play around with a few years ago. So I've got that one that falls into rotation. I haven't really gone too far down the rabbit hole of trying a ton of different glides, though. I kind of have, despite I got a couple of smaller Westons, despite your obsession with them at times and the different sizes and kinds and everything, I haven't gone too deep into variety. So yeah.
Well, I have. I mean, I certainly have not tried everything, but I've tried a lot. And there's all kinds of different styles and nuances. But if we're talking about going fast and something that you guys could buy right now, I think the Tidal Pro, the Tsunami, is a great option. It does exactly that. The Yozuri twitch bait actually is a good option. It comes in a few different sizes. The big one is the one probably to get, but the next size down from there is good too. The smaller ones I've had trouble with getting to do what I want them to do, but that's probably because I'm overloading them with the wrong hooks or something like that, because I'm immediately taking hooks off and testing these and putting other hooks on and stuff. But all hail the Weston Swim. Weston Swim. You don't have to get the saltwater because you're going to want to change the hooks anyways. The 10, 12, or 15 centimeter, they're all good based on what you want to do. But when it comes to fussy fish and going fast, that's my go-to. I mean, that really has become my go-to. I can really hammer on those, and they work great. But, I mean, Mike's Customs works great. Larson is great. RG Lures, he's great. Did I get that right? I hope I just said it right. He makes great stuff. There's this thing called the McJerk, which is actually a pretty decent one. And then we get into all the non-swimming ones, which I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole because there's a lot there as well that actually can do the same thing, but you have to have a different water quality in terms of depth, current speed, waves, and wind for your bow and your line. With the swimming ones, you can get away with a lot more. With the jerkbait style ones, they require different conditions. So if you're just getting started and you're dealing with fussy fish and you want to try the glide bait, see if you can break through, I would say stick to ones that Toby mentioned or these ones that I just mentioned. And I think that they can make a big difference the next time you head out and find some fussy fish. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.